Excuse me. Sorry. First track on that album that is released as a single is called Dream On. Okay. I get it. You don't listen to Dream On classic rock radio right now and think of it as a heavy metal song. But I will tell you that that is your blueprint for your tempo change, modern day heavy metal music. This is what guys like Metallica would listen to and say, hey, check this out. This is how the song starts, and this is where it works its way to, and then listen to what it's doing over here. This is like Stairway to Heaven, but it's loud the whole time. Let's do that. So you've got Dream On. Blue Oyster Cult releases another album at this point in time. It rocks. Alice Cooper, in March of this year, releases an album called $1 Billion Babies. And another one of those songs, which is sort of on that Schools Out tier, called No More Mr. Nice Guy, comes out on this record. So Alice Cooper is all of a sudden sitting on top of the world because they've got two amazing albums, one right after the other, with two huge hit songs coming off of them, and they're playing these on the radio. As we look through the year, I want to get through these a little bit quicker now, but this band from England who started off as a small club band called Smile until they hired this lead singer who approached them after a show one night and said, you guys don't have a real lead singer. I'll do it, and and I'll kill it, and I'll even write songs with you. And they were like, okay. So all of a sudden, Queen is born. Their first album comes out 1973 in July, and it rocks extremely hard, and it metals extremely hard. Another band which brought a little bit of country music into the hard rock scene called Lynyrd Skynyrd releases their first album this year. Might not be something that you normally would think about as far as the heavy metal market goes, but if you consider the dual guitar attack and the trading lead guitars, which is something that a lot of metal bands adapted into their sound, that's where that came from. Two lead guitar players. Lynyrd Skynyrd. And a little band called Montrose releases their first album this year, which is, it's a hard rocking album, and it's got some pop rock stuff on it. It's got some danceable music on there, but I think what really happens that is most important at this point in time is there's this guy who comes from a band called Montrose who released their first album this year named Sammy Hagar, who at some point down the road becomes, semi-popular in the rock and roll world. Maybe Sammy Hagar. Anybody? And just to round out sort of the end of the year, we got a band called Black Sabbath releasing an album called Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which includes probably their heaviest guitar riff of all time on the title track to the song. Oh, and by the way, they still haven't waned in popularity after releasing their fifth heavy metal album, In a World in 1973, heading into 1974, that's focused on disco music, and that's just about to be overcome with punk rockers. They're still hitting it. 1974 rolls around, and the aforementioned live band Kiss releases their first record with a track that ends the record called Black Diamond, which is probably about the heaviest and darkest number to be released by anybody at that point in time ever, and I don't even think they did it on purpose, but they did it nevertheless. Queen releases another album this year. Aerosmith releases another album this year. Oh, and by the way, Aerosmith's album just happens to include a live version of a track called Train Kept A-Rollin'. I think we've heard that before, haven't we? Well, they just turned it up a little bit further, and they made it a little bit faster, and they made it a little bit more gutty and gritty and dirty and mean, and they Aerosmithed it. And then in that same month, which is, I want to say March of 1974, this band comes down out of Canada and releases their first self-titled album with a drummer that would disappear after the release of this album. And after two huge hit songs, a band called Rush is all of a sudden on the scene. Progressive metal coming? Yeah. We have an album in April of this year called Secret Treaties by a band that we've mentioned before called Blue Oyster Cult. The thing about Secret Treaties is on the second side of the album, all the way at the very end of it, there's a song called Astronomy. Now, this may or may not, if you're a, Don't Fear the Reaper kind of fan, this may or may not be the greatest number that Blue Oyster Cult ever put to record. Not only that, but in 1998, this little band from San Francisco covered the track on an album called Garage Inc. These guys were called Metallica? Oh, greatest cover song they ever did. Now, Metallica can take anybody's music and turn it into their own. But Astronomy has the most passion. It's got the most force. It's got the most feeling. That became a Blue Oyster Cult song into a Metallica song. 100%. Like, you can't pull anything away from what Metallica did to that song. Now, I know people will cover songs and you'll say, well, but the original had this. And, well, they kind of changed this and it doesn't really have the same feeling. No. Astronomy is now a Metallica song as of 1998, and it is amazing. However, Astronomy from Blue Oyster Cult on the album Secret Treaties from 1974, top notch. Could be, like I said, the best song they ever put to record. We had some other things happen in 1974. There was a band called Bad Company that released an album called Bad Company that had a single on it called Bad Company that had dirtiest, nastiest blues-style guitar playing behind the piano that led the song. And so if you're not listening for it, you almost don't really even get it. But Mick Ralphs on guitar just all of a sudden was like, oh, watch how dirty and heavy we can get on this song that's going to get airplay for 50 years to come. Just watch. He did it. In September of this year. Now, I'll touch on it just for a second, and then we're going to move past it because something else happens later for these guys. But this band called Judas Priest released their first album, September of 1974. Kiss comes out. They release album number 2 already called Hotter Than Hell. They're still just flying. Queen comes out. They release Sheer Heart Attack, which might include the first speed metal song. Maybe. Stone Cold Crazy. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard that. Excuse me for a second. I just need to plug in the camera / phone here so I don't lose you guys again, which I've done already, I don't know, a couple times. But yeah, they released an album called Sheer Heart Attack. It's got a song on it called Stone Cold Crazy, which in 1990 was coincidentally covered by a band called Metallica. And they turned it into their own song. So much so that when Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, died in 1991, the band did a tribute concert and invited everybody and their dog into Wembley Stadium to come and play some songs. And remember, Freddie Mercury, James Hetfield from Metallica, joined Queen on stage to perform Stone Cold Crazy. And just to go a little bit deeper into that one, not that it matters a whole lot if we're talking 90s music, but the rhythm guitar player on that track was none other than Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath. So there's that. 1975. So we got Rush, Led Zeppelin, Alice Cooper, Kiss, Bad Company, Aerosmith, and then, oh goodness, April, we have an album called Hair of the Dog, released by a band called Nazareth. Now, you'll remember Hair of the Dog because of a song called Love Hurts, which probably had the grittiest, dirtiest vocal for a mellow, soft ballad ever. But the opening track to that album, the title track to that album called Hair of the Dog, that song, all the way back in 1975, that birthed Guns N' Roses, 1987. And you would know, if you listen to Guns N' Roses' first album and then listen to Hair of the Dog by Nazareth, you know exactly where they came from. Yes, Guns N' Roses pulled from Motley Crue. Guns N' Roses pulled from Rat. They pulled from Dokken. They pulled from Wasp. They pulled from a band that hadn't even been signed yet that moved all the way out from Pennsylvania and hired a blonde California guitar player called Poison. They pulled from a band that helped all these other guys learn how to play their instruments and gave them food and gave them a place to stay called Cinderella, who also coincidentally moved out from Pennsylvania. Guns N' Roses grabbed stuff from all those guys, but the main ingredient came from 1975 in this Nazareth song called Hair of the Dog. Just check that out and you'll understand. Black Sabbath releasing another album this year called Sabotage, and guess what? It's no different. Heavier, louder, dirtier, nastier, more heavy metal than the previous ones. All they've done is gotten a little bit more heavy metal with each album up to this point, which makes me actually want to stop talking about Black Sabbath at this point in time. Sorry, Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die fans. This is the pinnacle right here in 1975. Also, in 1975, a guitar player who was with Deep Purple through their Mark II years, which were the popular years, the ones that everybody likes, listens to, buys, and wants to hear over and over again. He starts another band called Rainbow, and they released their first album. On that album, they brought it back to the very first time that Deep Purple decided they were going to crank up the reverb on the guitar, and they were going to throw some effects pedals on there, and they were going to play that organ through a guitar amplifier so it sounds loud and crunchy and dirty. Well, Rainbow is that band. They're doing that now. But Ritchie Blackmore needed a new singer because Ian Gillan is still with Deep Purple. So he hires this little guy. Yeah. Probably about that tall. His name is Ronnie James Dio. You ever heard of Ronnie James Dio? You heard of a band called Black Sabbath? Well, guess what? When Ozzy Osbourne went solo, guess who sang for Black Sabbath? And guess what else? There's a band called Dio who released a handful of heavy metal albums in the 80s. That's his band. He came over as the bass player from a band called Elf. And Ritchie Blackmore said, "You want to sing for my group?" And he said, "Okay." Rainbow was born. The aforementioned Alive by Kiss comes out this year. Once again, the live album that people usually judge live albums by. The difference between that and the one that I talked about earlier, the Deep Purple Made in Japan, is this one was doctored back in the studio. They put together the best parts of all the shows, and then they manipulated the sounds to make it sound as clear as they could. It was a put together album. It wasn't just a nuclear live album like Made in Japan was by Deep Purple. But it's terrific. Rush releases another album this year. Deep Purple releases another album this year, but at this point in time, there's rarely a member left from the original lineup of this band. It's going to take them a minute to come back full circle and actually regain their glory, but they're still Deep Purple. Queen releases this album called A Night at the Opera. And if we may just move away from the heavy metal just for a second, this album had a song right close towards the end of the album. Now, the last track on here was an instrumental called God Save the Queen, which is, they're from England and they just do that. God Save the Queen. It's a traditional number. It was rearranged by the guitar player and performed as an instrumental song by the band. But prior to that, the real closing track to the album is a song that hit the charts in 1976 and then again in 1992 and skyrocketed to the top. It's called Bohemian Rhapsody. All right, not heavy metal, but it's got a little section in it, which people in the movie Wayne's World headbang to, so we can put that on there, right? In December of this year, there's a band who had previously only released music in Australia. This year, they decided they're going to go national. They're going to go worldwide. And they released an album called TNT. And it's got a track on it, which was on their previous album, but like I said, was only released in Australia. It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll. They said it right there in the name. AC/DC's a rock and roll band. But their influence on heavy metal, you can't state it. You just can't even quantify that with a number. AC/DC comes out worldwide in 1975. 1976, we can roll through this again. Black Sabbath releases a best of album, sort of a compilation. Kiss releases... Just wait. Kiss releases an album called Destroyer, which, for a band that had to put together a live album just to try to get themselves something gold, to release an album like this right after that goes multi-platinum immediately, I think they found a winning formula. God of Thunder, Detroit Rock City, another power ballad, Beth, all here on Destroyer. Judas Priest, who we talked about for a second before, releases an album called Sad Wings of Destiny, March 26, 1975. And what do? As they're being interviewed for this album, because of the crowds they're drawing and because of the attention that they're garnering, and because of the fact that bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Black Sabbath keep saying stuff like, oh, we're a folk band, oh, we're a pop band, oh, we're a jazz band. I'm not kidding you, Black Sabbath had referred to themselves as a jazz band. Judas Priest came out and said, we're a heavy metal band. They're the first ones. Judas Priest started this role right here in 1976, holding that heavy metal flag up in the air and saying, this is who we are, this is what we play, and this is what we're always going to be, and they've done it ever since. Sad Wings of Destiny comes out in 1976. There's a song called Victim of Changes, which was partially written by a previous vocalist who's not in the band anymore, wasn't in the band when they started recording songs anyway. You'll recognize the familiar Rob Halford scream and the Tipton and Downing guitars. These guys are off and running now, and they are carrying the torch that says heavy metal. And as they're doing this, Thin Lizzy, we've mentioned them for a minute before, they released an album called Jailbreak. It's got a couple of heavy songs on it. A lot of people will say, oh yeah, I was influenced by Thin Lizzy, but these guys, they weren't really that heavy. They did have a 2-guitar attack, which, again, if you go back to Leonard Skinner, that kind of puts them in that same category with influences on some of these modern heavy metal artists. Rush releases this little album called 2112. I'm not going to dig into that one so much because a lot of people will just consider that straight up progressive rock. But if we're going to talk at some point about bands like Queensryche and Dream Theater and Fate's Warning, progressive metal started right here. 2112 by Rush. Aerosmith releases another album this year, which goes huge. AC/DC releases an album that is international. They release it outside of Australia again to try to help boost the sales of TNT. So we've got an album that's got some of the same tracks on it. And then we have the title track from the previous album, TNT, which all of a sudden hits the radio and takes off. Alice Cooper releases another album. Now we get to the second half of the year, and the band is... They didn't start as a band. They started as a guy in his studio, sort of tinkering with things, creating sounds, trying to find that right guitar sound that he wanted to sort of purvey the message he was trying to get along with, the songs that he had written. And he hires a buddy of his to come in and do some vocal work for him. And eventually, as he's messing around, he decides, probably I've got the sounds down. I've got exactly what I'm looking for here, but I want somebody that's going to add a little kick. And he brings a drummer in, somebody who never ended up being a part of the band. Anyway, records this album, 8 tracks, 40 minutes worth of music. And as he's done recording this, as he's shopping it to record labels, he's writing this little dictation that he's putting down, so he's going to print it as he hands this album out to people, telling them what they're in for, and mentions the term heavy rock 6 or 7 times, I think, throughout that. And finally gets Epic Records to bite on it. They tell him, look, you got to hire a band because you got to be able to play this stuff in concert. And they're going to go back and they're going to overdub some of the tracks. They're going to play a little bass. They're going to play a little more guitar. We're going to overdub some of the vocals, and we're going to bring this up a little bit higher. And we're going to make it sound a little bit bigger and a little bit more bombastic. What ends up being released as the final product is, by and large, 90% what this man created in his basement. The album is called Boston. The band is called Boston. Nobody ever says heavy metal and then says Boston. But with the sound that he created to get the guitars to be exactly where he wanted them to be, and this is sometimes double and triple and quadruple tracked guitars playing one on top of the other, he invented a piece of studio equipment to recreate that sound, which took off and people ran with it for years, decades. He invented it right there in his basement, and at the release of this album, he had perfected that sound before he was able to even put that piece of equipment out to be sold. So Boston is a pioneer in the heavy metal sound, even though they didn't play necessarily heavy metal music. As Tom Schultz said, it's heavy rock. So there was that. AC/DC releases another album in September, just something small called Dirty Deeds, Done Dirt Cheap, which you may have heard once or twice on the radio. Black Sabbath releases something that we probably just don't even talk about. Led Zeppelin releases a live album called The Song Remains the Same. This is a double record set, and it becomes the soundtrack to a film that they've released at the same time, which to this day might still stand as the greatest rock and roll music movie of all time. Maybe. The soundtrack is top notch. This is Zeppelin, the four guys from the band, no backup musicians, nothing doctored in the studio afterwards. They went out and they played, they recorded it, and it sounds perfect. The Song Remains the Same, October of this year. Now, a band that I've sort of glossed over for a couple of years here, only simply because they become so much more popular later on, but this is sort of when they become infamous. The Scorpions released an album this year called Virgin Killer. You can kind of look that up if you want to get an idea as to what the problem was with this album. They did re-release it with a different cover that shows the band members on it. But this is all of a sudden when they're starting to gain some traction in the media. And then we go to 1977. There's more rock and more glam sort of permeating the metal landscape right now. AC/DC still releasing records. Judas Priest releases one that doesn't gain much fanfare. Alice Cooper releases one that again doesn't gain much fanfare. The Amboy Dukes' previous guitar player, Ted Nugent, releases an album called Cat Scratch Fever, which you may have heard of, which all of a sudden skyrockets him to the top of the charts, and that's a pretty heavy record. Kiss releases Love Gun, which, although they didn't take the makeup off after this yet, and they didn't really necessarily shed band members off of this, this was the last real classic Kiss album, because after this there was too many studio musicians coming in. Nobody knew who was playing the lead guitar. Nobody knew who was playing the drums on these on the rest of the songs after this. There's so many different stories out there of different people coming in and producing these songs and even grabbing the recordings and taking them back to their houses and over-tracking even the bass and the rhythm guitar, which, I mean, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, who play bass and rhythm, they're the band leaders. Kiss is Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, and some of their parts are even being re-recorded by producers and outside musicians after this album. But Love Gun is a Kiss album, and so that one was released this year. Rainbow released a live album this year called On Stage, which that was a huge one for them. A little band that, you know, you didn't hear of back in 1977 because they didn't gain any traction yet. It probably took them another 3 years before you'd actually know what their name was. But Motorhead releases their first album in 1980. Thin Lizzy releases probably their last great album. It's called Bad Reputation this year. Rush releases an album that pole vaults them into superstardom called A Farewell to Kings. All of a sudden, this band that's a progressive band whose songs are way too long to play on the radio is on the radio with a song that's not even 3 minutes long called Closer to the Heart. Something that, well, okay, so let's touch on this for just a second. Kiss releases a Live 2 this year, which is basically the next tour, the songs they've added to the set list. Now they're showing up on the live album, and it's doctored the same way as the previous one was. But they also released 4 new studio tracks on this album, and they start what sort of puts them into, because Ace Frehley, the lead guitar player, releases a track. He records a track for this album, which none of the other guys even played on. He's got other musicians that he works with when he's writing songs, and they've done the recording and played on this track. This album is kind of the start of each of the 4 original band members releasing a studio album the next year. Now, some of these guys cross-played on each other's albums and helped write and produce and things like that, but this is really where it started to split. This album is terrific. Alive 2 is a great live album, and the 4 tracks that they released that were brand new studio tracks are terrific. But I think this is where the downfall really started, because they all went solo after this. Even though they reconvened and released more Kiss records, it wasn't the same, as I mentioned before. Queen releases an album called News of the World this year, which has a song on it called We Are the Champions, which was considered to be a single, and what they ended up deciding to do was shelf that. So they released a song called We Will Rock You instead, which was something that guitarist Brian May wrote so they could get the crowd involved in the song that they were singing. And they thought, we're shelving this other single, let's just throw it on the B-side to We Will Rock You. So we have We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions all of a sudden getting played back to back on the radio. And they still do it to this very day. Not heavy metal, but it's got that same attitude, that panache. It's got the influence. It's there. I mean, it's in the wheelhouse, and it's Queen. They were early heavy metal pioneers. Blue Oyster Cult released an album this year called Spectres. This came out in November.